Here he is, a black man who looks white, wearing blackface, pretending to be a black man so he could make fun of his own community. When we talk about gender norm, they too are so deeply entrenched and so ingrained that we become complicit in our own oppression.
The two things that stood out to me were the terror and the desperation. If you think of what fascist regimes do, the first thing they do, or one of the first things they do, is to ban books. Because
Hi, and welcome to the Changemakers book club. I'm Gunjali, and I'm so glad you're here. I've spent over a decade working in the development sector, and this podcast brings together two things I care deeply about: powerful stories and the passionate people who are working to drive real change in the world. In each episode, we dive into a contemporary book with people who are driving change and how it connects to the way they see the world and the change we need to make. I hope it leaves you with fresh ideas, renewed hope, and a good book recommendation to dive into. Now let's get into the conversation. James by Percival Everett is a bold, brilliant reimagining of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This time told from the perspective of Jim, the enslaved man at the heart of the original story. The language is contemporary and sharp, and I have a feeling this is a book more and more younger readers will be drawn to, and for many, this will be their only exposure to Twain's original. Retelling a familiar story is not easy, especially when you're out to challenge the familiarity that readers may have with what they've read before. But with James, Percival doesn't just retell Huck Finn, he completely reclaims it. He makes the story his own, boldly departing from the original in ways that are both powerful and necessary. And yes, you don't have to have read the original to read James. Reading James was an intense emotional experience for me. It's rooted in the harsh reality of someone trapped by forces bigger than himself. But it's also full of adventure, wit, and unforgettable moments. Some people have talked about the humor in the book, and yes, there are flashes of it. But for me, it was a tough read. I had to put it down multiple times. Everett doesn't flinch from exploring incredibly difficult, violent realities, and the emotional impact is real. It's a gut punch of a book, one that lingers long after you turn the last page. James was one of the most anticipated books of 2024, and it really delivered. It won the 2024 National Book Award for Fiction and was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize. With the film rights already bought over by Universal and Steven Spielberg as the executive producer, we are sure to see a fantastic movie adaptation soon. I had the chance to dive deeper into James in a rich and honest conversation with today's guests, Nisha and Bhakti. We talked about language, resistance, survival, and how the struggles James faces in the story echo so many of the dynamics we still see in the world today. It was a conversation that opened up new layers of the book for me, and I'm so excited to share it with you. Let's dive into our conversation on James. Bhakti Mathur is an ex-banker turned children's book author with 20 published titles, including the Amma Tell Me and Amma Take Me series. She hosts storytelling sessions, reading workshops across schools, and literary festivals in Hong Kong, Singapore, and India. She's also a culture and wellness writer, an executive coach, yoga teacher, and someone who believes deeply in the healing and transformative powers of stories. She's also a bibliotherapist, and we'll have you talk a little bit about that later, Bhakti, but welcome.
thank you, Gunjali. It's great to be here.
Nisha is the Vice President of Impact and Influence at Empower, where she works to center the voices and wisdom of girls in philanthropy and programming across 15 countries. She has a background in gender, development, and sociology, and she brings a fierce love for feminist literature, big ideas, and conversations that push us to think differently about the world. Great to have you, Nisha.
So lovely to be here.
So let me start with you, Nisha. Tell us how you would describe the experience of reading the book.
Honestly, Gunjali, it took me a while to get into the book. This pivotal moment happened halfway through the book, and it's interesting because it was when Jim and Huck separated, and all of a sudden Huck is meeting all of these other people, and it was actually his interaction with the smaller characters in the books who had my heart more than his interaction with Huck. Their separation was that moment for me. It was these characters and the stories that they were telling, but also what they stood for that really moved me. So I think the first was Norman. Norman could have had a safe enough life. He would not have been hit. He was not in any danger. He looked white enough, but he was done with that. He was done being a Black man who was pretending. So here he is, a Black man who looks white, wearing blackface, pretending to be a Black man so he could make fun of his own community. And all of a sudden, Jim gave him this moment where he was like, I'm done here. What's really interesting is the environment that he was in. The rest of his troop were like, we're not abolitionists, but we think slavery is bad. We're just lukewarm about this and we're not going to do very much. And that wasn't enough for Norman. So I think he was one character that really moved me. Young George, who steals a pencil for the greater good and then suffers the punishment for it, right? Like, definitely is beaten, maybe is hung, because he wanted to bring voice into the community. And Jim did just that. But I also think like the flip side of it was people like Brock and Luke. So we see Brock for like 6 pages, but he hit me so hard because he embodied a coping mechanism of slavery in so many ways, right? He had this imaginary master. He was working away. He never saw another human being. We never saw light, but he's like, I am doing this because this is my job. And it was just that complete submission or dehumanization. Again, the cold's not so bad and the working conditions are not so bad. And just that complete acceptance of his reality. And then you have, on the other hand, another coping mechanism of slavery, which is Luke. And you see this time and time again, where you have people who are from marginalized communities, from marginalized races, classes, but Luke found himself a position that keeps him relatively safe at the cost of beating up others or being complicit with the oppression of other Black people. He's like, I'm a safe Black guy and I will be treated slightly better. And both Brock and Luke represent like the extreme ends almost of coping mechanisms in the face of systemic oppression. And I have to talk about the women because I think they, as somebody who works in the gender space, Sammy and Katie, what they both represent is that women in slavery not only experience the extreme dehumanization and devaluing of their sense of self as slaves, but face the additional layer of gender-based violence and abuse, right? And it's really interesting that rape is just a matter of fact, right? Like when Sammy talks about whether her master knows that she's a woman or not, and she's like, of course he does. And here's how I know. And it's because of this whole other thing that I am systematically dealing with that I cannot run away from. And it's really interesting to see Jim's interaction, right? Because he put his life on the line for Sammy and got her out. And when she died, when she was shot, he said, at least she's free. And then similarly, it was Katie that got him to snap because he witnessed her being raped. So I think those were the two characters that really got me. And I feel like I should say something about Huck. He's great. He really is. But I just think these characters move me so much more. But I think that moment where Huck puts himself between him and Jim and he's like, you cannot abuse him. You have this moment where you have an adolescent boy who's not old enough to be an active agent of change. He cannot be Jim's owner in the way that Norman could have a facade and they could hatch this plan where Jim was being resold and resold. But Huck stood in his own power and in his own agents. And that shows us what the power of adolescence is. And the reverse of that is Jim finally melted in front of Huck. And through language, we see that being melted, where he just sits down and he's like, let me tell you, I'm talking to you like I really talk. And that trope of language comes out so strongly in Huck and Jim's evolving relationship. So definitely enjoyed reading it. But I guess what moved me were a lot of people that Jim met on his way. more than anything else.
I definitely had these gut punch moments. I had to put the book down quite a few times. It wasn't easy to get through these rape. I think even when young George was getting whipped, I had to put the book down for a bit. But tell us what it was like for you to read the book.
I think one of the things that stood out to me was a point of view, that this book was being told from Jim's point of view. And there have been so many interesting books of late. Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, which is retelling of David Copperfield. Then there is also Wild Sargasso Sea, which is the retelling of Bertha, if you remember that character from Jane Eyre. And it's the retelling of the story when she marries Mr. Rochester from her point of view. So I thought this was so timely. And I think when we change a point of view or when we see things from somebody's perspective, our perspective changes. So I think that's a big thing that this book did for me. The other two things that stood out to me were the terror and the desperation. And they stood out to me in a couple of scenes that Nisha spoke about, especially about pretending to be a white person, pretending to be black in the plays, but also in the beginning when the two white boys were coming after him and he uses language to alert the others. That was one scene. And the other is when he was with Huck hiding on the boat. So I actually read this book, but I read it by hearing it on Audible. And what was amazing about hearing it on Audible is because it's so much about language and so much about the slaves changing their pronunciation and their diction when their masters are around. So it really came out listening to it. The other few things that really stood out to me is one is that I don't think I've ever been so emotional about a pencil. I think that was really gut-wrenching. The dialogues that James has with Voltaire, with Rousseau, with other philosophers, talking about their point of view on life, but also how his experience has stood up against it, was magnificent. And I was listening to an interview by Percival Everett where he was being asked about his inspiration for the book. And he said that every American author has been influenced by Mark Twain, whether they agree to it or not. And he said he read Huckleberry Finn 15 times, one after the other. He said, I wanted to read it and get fed up of it so that I could write it in my own way. And he says, whereas Twain was writing about a young white boy, he says, I'm writing about a grown-up or middle-aged black person. And I'm going to quote him. He was asked, what is the one thing or the worst thing you think slavery has done or did? And he said, the fact that James had to suppress his true feelings and true nature to save his family, he said, is the most damaging part of slavery. So what this book also made me think of is two things. One is, I'm using harsh words here, but modern day slavery, as in, how do we treat people that we have power over, whether it's in a work setup or whether it's at home with a house help? And I remember the saying that who we truly are is how we behave when no one is watching. So how we behave with people we have some kind of leverage over. And this book really made me think of that. And the other is when Jim and his companions would change their accent to comply to what was expected of them from their white masters, it made me think also in a different way of how we sometimes underplay our true abilities, perhaps to make other people around us feel more comfortable. And there's no right or wrong, but it did make me think of these points. The book really touched me and it really made me think deep. And you were saying about the sexual abuse, that about the rape, that it's so factual. Like that's how endemic it was, that it's a fact. It becomes a fact and that's what it is.
Truly was one of the most hard-hitting parts about the book. And I think what Bhakti mentioned is a great segue about what I wanted to talk to you about, Nisha. Your work with Empower, you're so close to what happens with marginalized communities. And Empower is a huge advocate for participatory approach. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, especially in the context of the book. Sometimes marginalized communities, and especially women, have to play to the gallows. So I really want you to talk about your work in terms of creating agency with youth and women and girls, Nisha, and talk about how that is so relevant in what you see today.
Let's start with the 2 or 3 key messages of the book. Number one takeaway for me is white privilege is so deeply entrenched, and racism is so deeply engaged, not only in heads and hearts, but also in institutions and in culture. The second is, and James says this a few times, that white folk take in the lie and throw away the truth that scares them. And the third is very much as a coping mechanism, is really for all of the slaves to take the actual path of least resistance. And there's this moment, which I found really fascinating, where they're like, tell him your name is February and say you were born in June, and we can make fun of the fact that Black folk are dumb like that because white folk love it so much. And it's all about keeping up the lie for safety so that those in power are not threatened. It's how do you keep people in positions of power in spaces and places where they stay safe? Because when they're safe, then the violence or the power dynamic in being preserved makes it safer for the oppressed. We see this a lot with gender and gender relations. But the flip side of that is the trope of this book was all about camaraderie, all about the fact that Michel Foucault talks about whenever there is power, there's resistance. And we see those small pockets of resistance across this book, right? With the theft of a pencil, with the running away, with 4 people finding Jim and saying, here's a hot meal. This is when he actually meets young George before the pencil is stolen. That sort of camaraderie are signs and spaces for those little pockets of resistance. And quite frankly, James stayed alive for as long as he did and made it home and met his wife and daughter at the end because of those pockets of resistance. And I think those are really good tropes to take into, quite frankly, my J job and what we do at Empower is that when we talk about gender and gender normed, they too are so deeply entrenched and so ingrained that we become complicit in our own oppression. So, but on the other hand, what this book also teaches us is when there's disruption and when systems are called into question, there is conflict, right? Here's a slave, like Bhakti just said, who reads and understands Voltaire and Locke, who writes, who has a voice and he wants to use it. And one of the most powerful pieces in this book was when James said, with this pencil, I write myself into being. And that's when he renamed himself and he says, I'm James. And that moment of transgression is not only for James, but for all of his allies to give the voice to the reality that's been silenced. And all of that is really what we're trying to do in our meaningful youth engagement work at Empower. It's about building that camaraderie amongst young people. It's about recognizing that small pockets of resistance are possible and there are other ways to imagine the world. But also, it's not only about yourself. It's about your families, your community. And when young people speak up and say, I am imagining a different life for myself, they're actually coming together not only for themselves, they're coming together for something bigger. And we see that again and again. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is the power of agency, of voice, of the written word, of language. And one of the things that we always say is there's no greater expert in the lives of girls than girls themselves. I have a fancy title in front of my name because I spent 7 years doing a PhD. But at the end of the day, does that doctor title give me more credibility than a girl herself about the lives of adolescent girls? And the answer is no, right? If we really want to change things, if we really want to make a pivot in the social impact space, we need to be meaningfully engaging with and talking to the people that we want to engage with, that we want to work with, because that's going to be the site of actual difference and also of transformation. Because if you work with a girl You ask her what she needs. You ask her what her community needs. And you become the scaffolding around her so that she can build the foundation and she can build the building. When the scaffolding falls away, the building is always going to be there. And that's what we really call transformational change. And all of that begins with that stolen pencil, that ability to speak in your own tongue, that ability to not have to shy away from who we are. And it's difficult, right? Because in James's case, and I'm consciously calling him James now and Jim earlier, in James's case, it erodes the ignorance that is needed for slavery to function. And it is difficult when we talk about gender in particular, because like Luke and like Brock, so many women conform to stay safe. And there's an author called Candy Rotten, and she writes about negotiating with patriarchy. And what she does, in order to stay safe and in order to maintain a sense of semblance, you don't mess with the power structure, but you create pockets of safety and a voice for yourself. And so much of the interplay of gender, especially in more patriarchal societies, is about how women negotiate with patriarchy to find their freedom. And the language or the use of language in this book is a phenomenal example of that. It's that negotiation to keep power structures in place. The second thing, and how this interplays between the book and my day job, is if we aren't listening, we might just be recreating a lie. It's very simple and very easy for a bunch of development sector professionals to sit around and say, here's a problem that needs to be solved in a basti in Bombay or in a favela or in rural Vietnam. But are we, in doing that, are we not upholding a power dynamic even in the development sector? And is it not our job to, not through stolen pencils and stolen notebooks and misappropriated voices, but isn't it our job then to create and hold space so that everyone can write themselves into being, everyone can speak about the issues that matter most to them? And so quite frankly, bridging the book to the work, I think if we want things to work in the social impact space, if we want to lead to transformation change, where young people are forever changed, then we have to write or speak people's experiences into being and really pay heed to them, listen deeply, and follow the advice of the true experts, who are the communities of young people who we are trying to engage with and help.
Thanks, Nisha. Bhakti, in our very own book club in Hong Kong, and I have to say I owe my love of book clubs to the original one that we had together. I remember a conversation about educated, and I remember us unpacking what it means not to have been educated or to have the access to knowledge. And that really came up many times in this book for me. You reflected on your gift of knowledge and education. You're a children's author. You're very passionate about children, really having the love of reading. I'd like you to talk about what being a bibliotherapist is about and how you felt about Jim's love for books, his lack of access, and his hunger for knowledge. How did that make you feel?
Bibliotherapy sounds complicated, but it's quite simple. It's made of two words, biblio and therapy. Biblio is the Greek word for books, and therapy, as we all know, is healing. So we read books to educate us, to inform us, to entertain us. But bibliotherapy is concerned with an important part, and that part is healing. How books heal us. And they do this in several ways. The most important is that in books, you will find any problem that you've had in your life written about. So whoever's had a problem has written about it and has written about it extensively. So when we pick up a book and see a character which is going through something similar that we are going through, there's a bit of distance between us and the character. And it is that distance which begins to give us a feeling of objectivity of looking at the situation. But more importantly, it tells us that we are not alone. Everything that we are going through, somebody else has gone through, and not only that, has written about it. And I think that is the real power of books. Because in moments like these, when you feel you're alone, you feel you're not understood, you can go on to do things which you may not live to regret. So that is really the power. And if you look at the history of bibliotherapy, it started way back with the Greeks and the Egyptians. So the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses, over the library in Thebes, had these words written, the house of healing for the soul. So they knew the power of books at that time. The Greeks used to have theaters built next to the hospitals. The reason being that they would send the patients to watch dramas, because when a patient went through the highs and lows of following emotions, it was actually cathartic. And then in the 12th century, in hospitals in Cairo, Quran was kept and given as recommended reading. In the 1800s, the same thing started happening in Massachusetts, where the Bible was kept. When the soldiers came back from World War I, they were given Jane Austen as reading. And then, of course, Freud and his compatriots really used reading as therapy. So this has been the genesis, but bibliotherapy, more on the recreational side, has become popular of late. There is an author called Ella Berthoud, who I studied under, who's written a book called The Novel Cure. And there are literally 155 ailments mentioned, from heartache to empty nesters to depression to headache. And for every ailment, there's a book that's given. So I think books like these and podcasts like yours talking about it is making it more and more popular. So that's a very long answer to your short question of what is bibliotherapy. And the second part of what you were saying about how I felt about James knowing how to read and not having access to it, it was really heartbreaking. My favorite part was the time when he realizes the power of reading for himself, even if he has to hide and do it. And this is when he and Huck are on the boat. He says, I really wanted to read. Though Huck was asleep, I could not chance his waking and discovering me with my face in an open book. Then I thought, how could he know that I was actually reading? I could simply claim to be staring dumbly at the letters and words, wondering what in the world they meant. How would he know? At that moment, the power of reading made itself clear and real to me. If I could see the words, then no one could control them or what I got from them. They couldn't even know if I was merely seeing them or reading them, sounding them out, or comprehending them. It was a completely private affair and completely free and therefore completely subversive. And if you think of what fascist regimes do, the first thing they do, or one of the first things they do, is to ban books. Because they don't want this kind of independent thinking, which is so critical to a mature and to a thriving society. And then I also thought, who would benefit from reading James? And the answer is everybody. And you know why? Firstly, it teaches us about perspectives. Secondly, it teaches us about courage. Then what Nisha was saying, a lot of camaraderie, companionship, working together. And then also people who take reading for granted. So I read this, there was a saying once that there's no difference between somebody who can't read and somebody who can but won't. And look at the struggles of people who want to read. So in a bibliotherapy context, this book, if I have to use the word prescribe, can be prescribed for so many things.
That's super, Bhakti, and it's such a novel concept to have a book that can actually help you with not just a disease, but something you're struggling with. I think you mentioned earlier in the podcast that you have not read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
And
I
very
think
long back
what
when I was growing up and didn't really remember the story.
I really feel like this book will be the introduction that many of us today might have to The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I think it's written in a very contemporary way. Is there a classic that you want to be retold or want a contemporary version of?
That's a great question. And I have been thinking about that because as I was thinking about Demon Copperfield and then I was thinking about Wild Sargasso Sea, There are two books that I read every year. One is Jane Eyre and the other is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And the way Rebecca is portrayed is evil. That's the only word I have for her. Really evil. But I would like to hear the story from her point of view. What if she was somebody who just had a large sexual appetite at that time and didn't know what to do about it? I'm sure there is a side to her story. Because she's portrayed as someone who's not good, and I think all of us have shades. Nobody's completely black and nobody's completely white. And I've been so fascinated with her character that I would really like to read a book from Rebecca's point of view.
Maybe that's your next project. Let me come to you now, Nisha. Would you recommend this book and why? And who do you think would benefit from reading it?
Absolutely. I would recommend this book. It's very important to encourage rewriting of histories, retelling of stories, and actually seeing things from another point of view. For too long, we accept one notion or one vantage point as being the reality. War is always written by the victors. History is always written by those in power. And what this is essentially doing is it's challenging that notion that there is only one point of view to a story, when in reality, it absolutely is not the case. I think what would stay with me in so many ways about this book is the power of the written word and the spoken word. So the written word is just, here is this complete anomaly. And as I mentioned, it took me a while to get into the book. I was like, come on, like how fictitious is this that Jim can read? It made zero sense to me that he taught himself how to read. It made zero sense to me that he's getting bitten by rattlesnakes and dreaming of Voltaire or Locke. I was like the cynic almost in reading this because it's such an anomaly and it's so not true. But the fact of the matter is it doesn't matter if it's real or not. And I had to keep on reminding myself that, listen, this is fiction. And what James represents is the power of the story, right? As Bhakti spoke about earlier with regards to bibliotherapy, being able to lose yourself and then find yourself again through reading is such a powerful and often underrated experience. And what this book confirms in so many ways is the ability to be able to sense me, not only what's in your head, but in the world around you through the exploration of another person's point of view, through an exploration of viewing the same story from a different vantage point, through an exploration of feelings that you may have that you find some sort of similarity with or some sort of catharsis with in the experience of the characters in the book. And for so many reasons, I would recommend this book wholeheartedly. Number one, because it confirms to us the power of telling the same story from another point of view and just that deep recognition that there is always more than one vantage point or more than one perspective to anything, whether that be a recounting of history, whether that be how you felt about a restaurant that you ate at yesterday, or even in a bilateral two-way conversation, the perspective that you're taking away. The second thing is it really confirms the power of literature, of the written word, as a tool of transformational change. So I would wholeheartedly recommend this book.
This has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much to both of you for helping me unpack the layers and the layers of this book. I think I enjoyed reading the book, but what I've enjoyed more is just talking to you both about it because I've learned so much more about the characters, the story, and how it relates to us as we live today. With that, we wrap up the Changemakers book club for James. Thank you, Nisha and Bhakti, for joining us. If you like what you heard about James, I have a couple of recommendations for you. Educated, which is a non-fictional account of Tara Westover's journey growing up in rural Idaho with no formal schooling to earning a PhD from Cambridge University. It's a story about the transformative power of education and the struggle to claim one's own voice and identity against overwhelming odds. And the other book that you may want to read is The Fraud, a beautifully written historical fiction set in the late 19th century featuring the Tichborne trial. Complex and full of nuance, as most of Zadie Smith's writing is. If you have thoughts about the episode, a book you think we should cover, or someone you'd love to hear from, please get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. This is Gunjali, and thank you for listening.